Okay, this is Pastor Eli James, and we're going to be discussing part one of our three-part series on who the true Israelites of the Scriptures are. And in this first segment, we're going to be talking about the chronicles of the migrations of the 12 tribes of Israel from the Caucasus mountain range into Europe. And in general terms, let me just preface this section by saying that in all of our history books, we see that the Caucasian people emerged from the Caucasus range, the Caucasus mountain range. And the history books will tell us that the Israelite people, or rather the Caucasian people, emerged around 700 BC from this mountain range. But the history books don't go any further into the previous history of the Caucasian people. It's as if they dropped out of space or crawled out of the ground and just appeared out of nowhere. But we're going to find that the Caucasian people actually originated in the 12 tribes of Israel, just to the south of the Caucasus mountain range, and emerged on the north side just a few years later as the Caucasian people. And the Bible tells us very clearly that the Caucasian people are descendants of the Israelites, and that the Caucasian people would forget their origin in Israel. And so we're going to be covering several prophecies that tell us that the Caucasian people are in fact the Israelites of the Bible. I'm going to begin by quoting Isaiah chapter 11, verse 11 and 16. And it shall come to pass in that day that the Lord shall set his hand again the second time to recover the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria, and from Egypt, and from Pathros, and from Cush, and from Elam, and from Shinar, and from Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. Now this is a much later portion of time in history. As I said, around 700 BC is when these events happened that the Bible is talking about. So this is a second Exodus we're talking about here. A second Exodus. Verse 16, and there shall be an highway for the remnant of his people, which shall be left from Assyria, like as it was to Israel in the day that he came up out of the land of Egypt. This is Isaiah chapter 11, verse 16. This verse is clearly telling us that there is going to be a road for the people of Israel out of Assyria, Assyria being north of Palestine, across this mountain range into northern, or actually southern Europe. Okay, that's what we're talking about here. And that highway, described in verse 16, is today known as the Dariel Pass. That's part of the Caucasian mountain range. And even to this day, the local people, the local inhabitants of this region, the Dariel Pass, refer to it as the Pass of Israel. So we have ongoing history when we actually trace the history of the Caucasian people from the west backwards in time and backwards towards the east along the Danube River, the various other rivers of Europe. We find that all of our people emerged from Armenia, just south of the Caucasus mountain range. Okay, and I want to verify. There's another passage in the Bible that verifies this passageway, and this is contained in the Apocrypha. Now, most of your Bible scholars will tell you that the Apocrypha are not legitimate literature, but I'm going to demonstrate to you that they are, because the Apocrypha are actually contained in the original King James Bible. And I have a facsimile of the original 1611 King James Bible. And if you zoom in on this Bible here, you will see King James Bible with Apocrypha. All of the original King James Bibles contained the Apocrypha. They were mysteriously removed from the Bible during a period from the Revolutionary War till about 1815, after which the Apocrypha mysteriously disappeared. Scholars will tell you that they're not necessary, but I can guarantee you that they are absolutely necessary for us to understand what the Bible is actually telling us. Because if we don't know our own history, we don't know who we are. If we don't know who we are, we don't know where we're going. And it's very critical that we understand who we are and where we're going. So now in 2nd Esdras, chapter 13, let me find the reference here. I failed to circle it. Okay. 2nd Esdras, chapter 13. I'm going to start quoting from verse 39. And whereas thou sawest that he gathered another peaceable multitude unto him, those are the 10 tribes, which were carried away prisoners out of their own land in the time of Hosea the king, whom Shalmaneser the king of Assyria led away captive. And he carried them over the waters, which is the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And so came they into another land. That other land was Armenia, which at that time was controlled by the Assyrians. But they took this counsel amongst themselves, that they would leave the multitude of the heathen, that is, the land to which the Assyrians brought them, starting in the year 745 BC, and that they would leave the multitude of the heathen and go forth into a further country where never mankind dwelt. And of course, where never mankind dwelt is a reference to the wilderness of Europe. That they might there keep their statutes, which they never kept in their own land. What this verse is telling us, it's verifying everything that we're told in the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, that the Israelite people began practicing pagan religion because they mixed their company with the Canaanites. And the Canaanites were practicing Baal worship. And our ancestors, the true Israelites, began practicing Baal worship along with the Canaanites, having orgies in the groves and worshiping other gods and violating Yahweh's laws. And because our people, our ancestors, refused to stop disobeying his laws by engaging in these pagan rituals, they were expelled. Repeating verses 41 and 42. But they took this counsel amongst themselves, that they would leave the multitude of the heathen, which is the other nations around them, and go forth into a farther country where never mankind dwelt, that they might there keep their statutes, which they had never kept in their own land. This is a tremendous summary of how the Israelites were relating to their God Yahweh and failing to obey his laws. And he promised these people that if they continue in disobedience, that he would expel them into the wilderness. And this is exactly what he did. Now it amazes me that your average Christian theologian knows absolutely nothing about these verses and about the history of these verses. Probably because the Apocrypha have been deleted from the Bible by some mysterious force, and these same people tell you, well, it's not important. It's not important that you know these things. Well, if you don't know these things, you're not going to know who you are. And it's very important that you know who you are. Continuing with verse 44, for the Most High then shone signs for them, and held still the flood, till they were passed over. For through that country there was a great way to go, namely of a year and a half, and the same region is called Ar-Sareth. Ar-Sareth is the territory north of the Caucasian Mountains. And so these verses are very clearly telling us that from Armenia they crossed the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, they went up through the Dariel Pass, through the Caucasus Mountains, and wound up on the other side, Ar-Sareth. And we know from tracing the history of our people from this area, their primary route into Europe was the Danube River, because the Danube River dumps into the Black Sea just west of the Caucasus Mountains, and by their ships, because our ancestors, both by ship and by covered wagon, migrated west into Europe, where such nations as Denmark, named after the tribe of Dan, Zebulon settled in the nation today called Holland, Issachar settled in the nation called today Finland, and we have places such as the Frisian territory, and Germany, Saxon. The Saxon area is named after Isaac, as a matter of fact, because Genesis 21:12 tells us, "In Isaac shall thy seed be called." Of course, no one ever quotes these verses, because if they quote these verses, you will ask, well, why aren't the Jews called by the name of Saxon? That's because they're not Saxons and they're not Israelites, as we will evidently and ultimately prove to you in this three-part series. Now, the Bible tells us that the Israelites would be known by another name, that they would be a great seafaring people, a great agricultural people, great builders of cities and nations. None of these things is true of the Jewish people. The fact is that if we go back into Genesis chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, we will find that there are two different groups of people that the Bible talks about. Two different genealogies. And one genealogy is the genealogy of Jesus Christ, carried through from Adam and Eve, down through Abraham, down through Isaac and Jacob, and ultimately, of course, Jesus Christ. Now, Jesus Christ has relatives in Europe called the Caucasian people, and we're going to be demonstrating that we are, in fact, his relatives, and the Jewish people are not. In fact, he disowns the Jewish people in many places in the New Testament. Now, we know also that Queen Elizabeth II today is, in fact, a literal descendant of King David. And there's a parable of the 153 fishes in the New Testament. And it turns out that from Adam to Queen Elizabeth II, there are 153 generations in this genealogical record. So all these numbers in the Bible have meanings, and we are going to investigate these meanings. Now, the Jews have not had a king. The Jews have not had a king since the days of Herod Agrippa. In fact, the Jewish people have only had 4 or 5 kings in their entire history. The first one being Herod the Great. And then he had offspring who continued as kings in Judea until the Romans sacked Jerusalem in 70 A.D. These are the only kings that the Jewish people have. But when we start quoting the marks of Israel, the true history, the prophetic record, and the historical record of the Israelite people, we will find that we have an unbroken genealogy, dynasty, of kings from David down to Queen Elizabeth II. The Jewish people cannot say this because they are not the Israelites of the Bible. Now we're going to be discussing the greatest plot of the Bible, which has been a forgotten plot, and it talks about the missing Israelites. How did the Israelites become a missing people, and how are we going to rediscover this people in the modern world? I'm going to be quoting now from Romans 11, chapter 1, which tells us this. I say then, hath God cast away his people? God forbid. For I also am an Israelite, of the seed of Abraham, of the tribe of Benjamin. So here Paul is telling us very clearly that he is a member of one of these 12 tribes. Now remember, earlier on, I said that the house of Judah, the southern house of Judah, remained in Judea. And this house of Judah consisted of only 2 tribes, Benjamin and Judah. So Paul was in fact a member of the house of Judah, of the tribe of Benjamin, and distinguishing himself from the lost tribes, which were in Arsareth, which had already disappeared 700 years before. And I'm going to demonstrate to you that the Judahites of the days of Jesus Christ understood that their kinsmen, the dispersed Israelite tribes, were actually living around the area of Judea, in Greece, in Rome, in Armenia, in Europe, and they knew this. They knew these things. And the New Testament tells us that they knew these things. For example, James 1:1 tells us, it introduces the book of James by saying, to the 12 tribes of Israel scattered abroad, greetings. That's how that book opens up. So James clearly understood that all 12 tribes were still in existence in his time, and he sent his epistle to them. Okay? Now, in this synopsis of the disappearance and reemergence of the 12 tribes of Israel, we're going to demonstrate that Israel was divided into 2 houses, the 10-tribe northern house of Israel, and the 2-tribe southern house of Judah. Also, that the house of Israel rebelled against Yahweh's law, adopting pagan practices, and was taken captive by the Assyrians as punishment for their refusal to obey his laws. Number 3, well into the future, these Israelites